And they were all young men, like they could be soldiers. Like in my head, in my like traumatized, I just watched all these videos and they're covering their faces and all of that. And they're just driving by me. And I mean, my world just got shook. Like,
why don't you think that people weren't as pro-Israel as you would have liked to have seen on October 7th?
I didn't even want them to be pro-Israel. I just wanted to be them pro the people, like victims of a horrific terrorist attack and anti-terrorism. That's how I would say it. That's what I expected, because that's what I expected of Western society, right? Like it wasn't like I expected that in like Egypt or something.
Wow. So when I looked that up, it's when I first heard about anti-Semitism. When I was looking up the stats for Black folks and things like that, and it was just like mind-boggling. And I was like, oh, okay, so that's a thing. That really is a thing. Because there were some social media posts and we were like discussing these things in like a family thread, and the case lawyer came up, and I asked my mother if she knew what that word meant, and she had no idea. She did not know the case lawyer. And I was like, yeah, I was talking to a buddy, and he was like blown away that my mother wouldn't have known that slur. And I'm like, yeah, no, because that hasn't really been a thing like within Black folks. Like we have no reason. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like what ends up happening a lot of times is I'm completely uninformed about a subject, and then because of that, I doubt a lot. So for instance, so I used to be a Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder fan. I'd heard a lot of their arguments. They were arguing with these college kids, and they sounded really, really intelligent. And I thought, wow, this is a very logic-based argument, and so I liked it. After a while, I finally eventually realized like how they were being dishonest, and I came to realize, okay, so this is whatever. And they're arguing against like young college kids who don't have the ability to argue against them, and they're prepared, whatever. These are young kids. What I learned was when you hear things really convincing in one side, it always appears to sound like reasonable and rational and all those kinds of things. And you really, sometimes you need life experience or to like really hear a strong, convincing argument from someone who's very like capable to be able to see the truth. I was raised in a cult, and I believed everything from it. I genuinely believed in my heart of hearts that
I didn't know you were raised.
Yeah, it was crazy. Wow. Yeah, I genuinely believe in my heart of hearts that we were the only church that was going to heaven, and any person that wasn't associated with it in any other organization, regardless of anything that they did, they weren't going to make it to heaven with us, which is how they taught us. There was all of these things that I had like internalized that it took me years and years and years. It wasn't until around 2017, 2018 where I finally was able to like, this isn't healthy, and I'm no longer going to be associated with this ever again. So that was like over 30 years of just the genuine belief. And even now to this day, I guess it's happened so much less now. But I would say up until like even like a year or two ago, I would still every now and then get the idea, what if they were right? And now I'm just lost and I'm deceived by Satan and I'm not living right and I'm gonna go to hell because I didn't stay with their practices. It just gets in you. So I said all that to say, it's a long, lengthy preamble. The whole point is you need to hear the other side. And right now on social media, like TikTok, Twitter, and anywhere, everything is completely pro-Palestine, it feels like. And I felt like you being a Jewish person, you would have some insights that they probably wouldn't be able to provide. I know that there are a few other like streaming, political discourse personalities who are speaking. Okay, I can't get it from CNN. I don't trust CNN. I don't trust the media, right? There's some big streamers who decided to take pro-Israel positions, but I don't think that they're good faith or honest people. So then it's like, I can't listen to them. I've always viewed you as good faith and honest. And so I felt like the only person that would probably give me a position that I would be able to listen to genuinely and take it in would be you. The floor is yours. You can start wherever you want to. I might ask questions every now and then. I promise you, my intent is never to be provocative, never to challenge. I just want to hear your perspective and gain as much insight from you as I can on this.
Sure. First I'll say, in the spirit of honesty, that I'm probably the most biased you can get in this situation, because I'm not just Jewish, right? I'm Israeli, and I'm not just Israeli. All my family's in Israel. And I was raised intensely with like a very intense Zionist perspective, not just with my parents, honestly, probably less so with my parents, but it was just my community, almost every Jewish community. If you, there's some Jews that are not raised in the Jewish community, and I was raised very much in the Jewish community in all the places I've lived in the world, and they were all very Zionist. And so it's impossible to kind of escape that narrative. And so I understand why some people will see me as biased, and I always felt like, especially when I got into the academic aspect of this topic. I always felt like I always had like a chip on my shoulder, like trying to prove, like, how can I prove that I'm not as biased as I really am, right? Like, how can I overcome this? And I almost compensated so much the other way. And I see some people do this, like for a lot of other things, where you kind of, and like, I know when people see my last name, they know I'm Jewish, they expect me to be super pro-Israel, they expect all these things, and I had like this urge to want to show that I'm different. I think for myself, I'm not going to be like the stereotype of someone who comes out of my community. So I really kind of went on a journey from being extremely just non-questioning pro-Israel, in the same way that, I'm not saying it's the same equivalent of the cult experience that you had, but in that kind of like, that's just the world that you live in, to wanting to ask questions. Once you find out one thing is wrong in the narrative that you're taught, it makes you question everything, right? So I went to university and I studied it, and I found out not just a lot of the things that I was taught was wrong, but I also learned that how insanely complex not just the history of the conflict was, but the history of teaching its history, right? How political that was, and how often the history was used to justify whatever vile actions people want to do today. So I kind of got really involved in it, and coincidentally, from an Israeli perspective, it was a much more peaceful time in Israel. Israel was doing much better economically from when I used to live there. When I used to live there, it was not doing that good economically, but in like the 2010s, it was doing extremely well. It was in like a kind of so-called peaceful time perspective. And that place of, and it was very rare. There weren't, when I was a little kid, there were often suicide attacks all the time, right? I lost a very close friend. But when I was in my 20s, that was not happening. As a consequence, it was much more, when you're not under attack, when you feel safer, it's much easier to see things with a broader view. And I think that allowed me to see a lot more things from a Palestinian perspective, and to get much more educated on what happened to them. And not kind of have this very main character syndrome that I think any oppressed group tends to go through, right? Some often justifiably, right? Yeah, but obviously things changed immensely, and for a lot of Jews on October 7th.
Right. So. Listen, I'm going to say really quickly, just to touch on something that you said earlier, I totally understand with the like compensating, you try to be the other way so as to like distance yourself from perception that people will see you as one thing, so on and so forth. When I spoke about like the internalized racism conversation a while back, that was what I found myself doing, where it would be like, I don't want to be associated with these stereotypes of black folks. So then I like literally intentionally changed the way that I spoke. And I mean, I guess there was art that influenced my mother who spoke that, but I would change my behaviors in order to distance myself from perceived like hood blackness. And as a result,
it's hard to know what's the real you and what's and what's the compensation.
Yeah, so I identify with what you're talking about. That makes so much sense to me. Thank you for sharing that. Continue.
Yeah, so I guess like I think for a long time, I definitely became extremely critical of Israel as I focused on things from a Palestinian perspective, but I never became what I would call like an anti-Zionist, which is like where you want the country of Israel to be destroyed. I think like I always still believed in I think most people who are very educated on the conflict do think the only viable solution is, at least in the near future, was a two-state one. So I believed in that. And so to me, it was all about advocating for a Palestinian state, especially amongst other Israelis who I felt like were the primary people who could make that happen, since Israel is a democracy, and advocating for that and all that kind of thing. I think like I don't know how much I trust a lot of like my personal political opinions right now, because a lot of them have changed drastically. And like, how much do you trust when your political opinions change in a day? A lot of your opinions change in a day. But I think like the way I've learned to somewhat accept it is it's a fear of survival, where I'm in a point, and I think a lot of Israelis, and that's how it felt that day. It almost felt like this is us or them, you know? And it felt like I didn't want my family to be the one to die. And it just felt like this immense, it just felt like this is war. As awful as that sounds. Because I won't be able to study crimes that happen to Palestinians or to do anything if Israel gets wiped out, right?
Right.
It was also, I also think I was somewhat shocked, and a lot of right-wing Israelis will get mad at me for this, but I was like very shocked at what happened that day, because I don't think I really believed that would have happened. I was very convinced the Palestinians were becoming less radicalized. I thought the problem much more on the other side of Israelis becoming more radicalized, with like the growing right movement and all of that kind of stuff. And I still remember watching the crowds of Gaza cheer as there were dead women on the back of trucks. That was really hard to see. At that point, I just thought they really want us dead, and that was like this intense feeling. And then I almost felt like I had to grow up out of like my old idealism. So again, I don't know how much I trust it, if it's just like this mindset that, biologically happens to you as a human, and like when you feel under attack. But yeah, that's, I guess, like how I've been feeling. And just as a consequence, the reaction to that day, I think like when that day happened, I didn't have to trust the Israeli government, who I hate, and I didn't have to trust the Israeli news, which can often be biased. I was on the phone with my family, right? I was on the phone with my friends. As these things were happening, it already gave me a certain perspective automatically, because I didn't have to do this thing where you have to like trust certain governments or trust a certain perspective online. Like, this was going on with my friends, my family. This was like very personal. So I knew all the atrocities that were happening on October 7th did happen. Like, obviously with some, like, I'm sure there were some minor exaggerations that happened, but like I knew the stuff that I knew was harsh enough that it changed my perspective immediately. And then afterwards, I expected everyone to treat it kind of like 9/11, even though it was so much worse than 9/11 for us, just proportionally, and in its viciousness, because of how you had to watch people being tortured, like yourself, on Facebook and stuff. And no one did. When I walked outside that day, I still didn't know my family was safe at the time, because people weren't answering the phones and stuff. And it was a holy day for us, so people weren't allowed to answer. And I walked outside, and the first thing I saw was a bunch of men who like were literally dressed in Hamas-style uniforms with like the red specific kafaya and all of that, and chanting intifada. And I actually thought that they were going to do it to me right there, like of all the videos I had just seen that day. Like, that's like, but they were just cheering, and that was just.
Were you in Israel at the time?
No, I was in Toronto.
Jeez. And you saw that in your own, like, outside of your. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, just when I wasn't looking for it. It wasn't a protest or anything. It was just, I remember them. I still remember this vividly, because they were driving up, and there was one guy on a bike next to him, and they were all young men. Like, they could be soldiers. Like, in my head, in my like traumatized, I just watched all these videos, and they're covering their faces and all of that. And they're just driving by me, and I mean, my world just got shook, like finding out what had happened, and I don't know if my family's safe. And then they're driving up, and I literally just thought, I remember freezing, and my Apple Watch literally was like, what's wrong? Because I could feel like my heart froze. And I just thought, oh my God, they're gonna do that to me right now, like right here in Canada. They didn't. They just went by, right? It was obviously just like a stupid trauma response, right? But I've never frozen like that in my entire life.
Sure. Just to,
I
don't think it's fair to call that a stupid trauma response. I think it sounds kind of realistic. If you have a perspective and you're seeing people like kind of cheering for dead people, you have people who are identifying with the people who are doing this thing. They're literally chanting Antifada, and you obviously see yourself as you're a Jewish person, so then you understand what that thing is. I mean, I think it's kind of like well-founded. It sounds like a well-founded fear, no? Like,
maybe, like, I would agree with you, maybe like 5 years ago, I would say that that's the case, but I'm almost in this new world where, especially that day, where my brother's best friend was calling us, crying, saying goodbye as he's like in as he's hiding in a dumpster with a few other people, and we can hear gunshots going on, right, and screaming going on. As a Jewish person, and especially as an Israeli outside of Israel, like having a trauma response when I wasn't even there, right? When I feel very privileged, like I feel like a real, like, super privileged first world problem type person, like to have such an intense reaction like that when I wasn't actually in the attacks, I wasn't in a war zone. I guess like it's just like it's just all about relativity. Like,
I mean, I hear you. I remember reading a study a long time ago when I went on Jesse Lee Peterson, he kind of made fun of me because he asked if I was traumatized by the George Floyd situation. Because I had said that in a previous video, and I said yes, like laughing at him. You're traumatized? And I was like, absolutely. And at the time, I hadn't read this study, but then later on, I read a study that like basically explained that for us, when we see those incidents happening, like when I see George Floyd or when I see Ahmaud Arbery or any of those kinds of things, that we have the tendency to put ourselves in that situation. So then it becomes incredibly personal when those people are shot in that way, or when they're murdered in that. And so in the same sense, and so then they started talking about how absorbing that type of media is literally naturally going to cause a trauma response. Likewise, I would imagine you being Jewish and understanding what's going, and then having siblings, or like you said, the best friend of your sibling, like explain this situation and the terror and trauma. If you have any kind of empathy like that, you're going to get secondhand from watching that person or hearing that person go through that experience and the uncertainty. All of those things, it sounds like it would be like equivalent, right? Where you would put yourself in that scenario. So then when similar situations happen here, then it would make sense. I've never, I didn't get murdered by the police. I'm not Sandra Bland. I'm not, whatever. But I know that when I would get pulled over, especially around that time, the sheer fear and panic that used to come over me during that time was insane. It was just like, I just hope to God that this doesn't go awry. I think I'm a pretty disarming guy. I'm pretty well spoken. I carry myself in a certain way that I would think.
You just go into kind of like survival.
Right. But you're just like, I hope they won't associate me, but then you just never know. And so it's just, that intensity is crazy. And so maybe someone can say, you crazy for thinking that way. I mean, I would imagine Philando Castile would have been crazy for feeling that way too. It's just, you can just go down the list and see how many of these incidents happen. And it's like, what's to stop me from being the next person? And even if it did happen and people started, I'm going to protest for a while. It's like after a week, they go back to their normal lives and then I'm gone forever, right?
Well, yeah, there were actually a bunch of people that warned Israel of October 7th, like within the military and intelligence. There had been people who had like warned them that there were plans, and there were because Hamas is not the best at hiding things, and these worries were just dismissed all the time by the government, by officials. No one thought that it could happen. Like no one thought they could do that. Even when the Nova massacre on October 7th happened, like if you watch some of the videos, initially people just think it's a part of like the show. Like they don't understand what's going on. They don't like think it's real. And I see this all the time, like in Toronto, like just like when you're walking down the street, if like you hear something that sounds like a gunshot, no one like reacts badly initially. They all just think it's fake. No one takes it seriously because 9 times out of 10 it's not. But there's at some like, there's, as long as there's a chance, it's like you've seen enough shit, it can still happen, right? So
right.
To this day, I hate seeing people with their face covered. Like I just can't do it. It always makes me nervous. Yeah, so I fucking hate that shit because of that day. So, and now actually the police are covering their faces too here in the city.
Wait, why?
It's a new thing. I guess to prevent harassment online, I'm assuming. I don't know. That's
wow.
Their story.
Oof, that's scary. There's so many things to talk about there, but we're gonna skip on past that. Okay, so then when October 7th happens and you're getting all of I'm assuming you still interact with social media around that time, and you're probably aware of how insanely pro-Palestine everything was. How did that impact you?
That was almost more traumatizing than anything. I think like I expected, like I remember when the Paris attacks happened, the CN Tower went like red and blue for France, and everyone was like, so there was like something that people put in like their profiles. It was like it wasn't a political gesture to say that you supported France during that time, even if you had a lot of disagreements with France. And the fact that I remember like Kylie Jenner posted, she said like standing with the people of Israel. And she got, and I was in like a bunch of celebrity subreddits and communities, and she was just getting like full canceled that day for saying that like she stood with the people of Israel on the day of like the harshest day of existence. And I still remember a lot of the comments were like, we all know why. Look at who she's dating. Oh man, I can't believe. And these were all the top voted shit. I was like,
who is she dating?
Celebrity comments, Timothy Chalamet.
Okay.
He's not even pro-Israel, he's just Jewish. So, and just seeing that on that day when I expected kind of like support, I expect when Israel is attacking Palestinians, like I totally expect there to be a lot of shit that I'm going to see online, but it was shocking to me to see it that day. Like the extent of it, and especially from like sources I didn't expect. That was really hard. And I think that it really contributed to an us or them mentality, right? Because there's something that Jews often get taught in some circles. I was taught it, I don't know if it's that often, but it's that non-Jews just don't care about. They don't really care about. And they might seem like they like us now, but eventually they're gonna hate us again. It's always what happens. And once we do badly enough, then they'll start pitying us and they'll like us again, and the cycle will just continue. And I never believed in that, and watching that happen that day, it was like, wow. It's just all these things that my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, like, had told me.
That's rough. Yeah. That's really, really, really rough. I don't know. I mean, I know of Jewish people. I just don't have any like Jewish friends that I've had like very intense conversations with in this regard. I don't think, like, I know people who are Jewish but don't have a very strong Jewish identity, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I think I've never really heard almost any of this kind of perspective. Why do you think that people were so? Why don't you think that people weren't as pro-Israel as you would have liked to have seen on October 7th?
I didn't even want them to be pro-Israel. I just wanted to be them pro the people, like victims of a horrific terrorist attack and anti-terrorism. That's how I would say it. That's what I expected, because that's what I expected of Western society, right? Like, it wasn't like I expected that in like Egypt or something. Yeah, and seeing how many young people like took that perspective, and I think that's what bothered me. Did you ask me why?
Yeah. Why do you think that was?
I think that's $1 million question. I think there's a lot of factors. I mean, I have some conspiracy theories like about it that have to do with Russia contributing to misinformation online. Not to the extent that like you don't need misinformation to be anti-Israel or very critical of Israel, but to the point that I saw that day where you're literally like cheering for like civilian deaths, there needs to be like some immense misinfo that's spread. I think like especially with things like TikTok or like infographics on Instagram, where it's so easy to mistranslate things in Arabic, to just share history, simplify very complicated things into something that's very easily digestible to someone online. I don't think like a lot of the people were evil who perpetuated this. I think they genuinely believed in their heart they were advocating for the underclass to rise up violently against their oppressor. A lot of money, and there's a lot of very big countries that are supporting articles that want to justify or downplay what happened on October 7th. I think I would say that it mostly has to do with that, with the misinformation that got spread for so long about it.
Okay, so you mentioned some of the misinformation. I would believe in that, and that led to people's apathy in some sort of way, which I can believe that as well. I remember I went into again, I don't have many like intentionally Jewish friends, and so intensely Jewish friends anyway. So when I went to, there was these grapers. I went there. They were talking some trash about them. I think this chick named Brittany V, or I don't know, some girl named Brittany. And she was streaming on their streaming Rumble. And I went in there because they were like talking trash about me. And so I was like, hey, you guys were talking some trash. What's up? And so we started talking about reparations and things. But during that conversation, they like started bringing up Jewish stuff. And I like listened before I joined, and then I listened after. And I realized like, oh, they really don't like Jewish people. And so I hear about anti-Semitism. Like, I know whenever we have discussions about hate crimes in this country, like during the Stop Asian Hate movement, I had to look up stats and things like that. And then there was a small point in time when anti-Semitic hate crimes actually surpassed anti-Black hate crime, which is crazy because anti-Black hate crimes have always been like hyper majority of like hate crimes received in the country by like a lion's share. It's not even close.
In Canada, they way outperform it.
Right, which is crazy to me. I just couldn't have even. That was mind-boggling to me. I would imagine proportionally might make a little bit more sense in Canada, because I would imagine the Black to Jewish population, maybe there might be differences in proportion, but in the United States it was crazy.
No, proportionally it's still
the same, or it's worse. Like I'm saying, proportionally there's less Jewish and more Black people in Canada, in Toronto.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Wow.
But I know like if you look at the stats proportionally to any population, like we vast outperform. It's like extremely depressing.
Sheesh, I'm sorry to hear that. Wow. So when I looked that up, it's when I first heard about anti-Semitism. When I was looking up the stats for Black folks and things like that, and it was just like mind-boggling. And I was like, oh, okay, so that's a thing. That really is a thing. Because there were some social media posts, and we were like discussing these things in like a family thread, and the case law came up, and I asked my mother if she knew what that word meant, and she had no idea. She did not know the case law, and I was like, yeah, I was talking to a buddy, and he was like blown away that my mother wouldn't have known that slur. And I'm like, yeah, no, because that hasn't really been a thing like within Black folks. That we have no reason. You know what I mean? So then it was mind-boggling. But the more I started interacting with those like online spaces, and then of course, my goodness, there's threads, because Twitter's become way like just toxic. Crazy. And there are threads where because during the Kanye thing, the Black people started taking Jewish stuff, like some of the pro-Black folk, and like we're echoing some of his talking points, and then the threads would just be nonstop, just craziness. And I started realizing like, okay, so anti-Semitism is a thing. I did not know. I would not know, because again, I don't have any Jewish friends. I'm not Jewish, so then I'm not checking for it. It's just not in my circle. But seeing that, it was like, whoa, okay, people really, really do despise some Jews. So I totally understand that. The other thing you said were people were genuinely believing they were rooting for an underclass uprising against their oppressors. Do you think that that's true? Or do you think that there's any basis for that?
No, I don't think that's true.
Okay.
I see October 7th as like a foreign government like supported and funded invasion, who are taking advantage of an oppressed group that they have purposely themselves kept in a state of oppression in order for their own political means and to happen. And that's just the stuff that there's evidence for. There's a billion conspiracy theories in my head. But yeah, that's not what happened on October 7th does not happen when an oppressed group stands up against their oppressors. That's like I can definitely confidently say that as a historian, and you're not completely like funded by foreign governments that have also manipulating and propagandizing and keeping those people themselves in a state of like this perpetual refugiedom, which is what I'm speaking specifically about, like Iran.
I see. Okay. I think that's beautifully stated. It gives me a lot of insight into your perspective, because that means that you view Hamas as something distinct from the other Palestinians.
I think it's like it's not just Hamas. There's a bunch of like radical terrorist groups that I would say like are distinct from Palestinians. If you look at the numbers, they overwhelmingly support these groups, but it's not something I completely trust because first of all, like the way they do these tests is like these people are living under like this super like autocratic like regime, where if people come up to your door and they say like, do you support Hamas, you don't know if that person's from Hamas. Like how can you trust it? So I don't believe like surveys fully that come out of it. And even for the ones who do support it, and I know that a huge majority do still support it, they've been trained, raised since birth. If you look at the textbooks and the curriculum, you can Google it online. They are trained to be anti-Semitic, like it's so it's not something, and this is something that is funded and perpetuated by Iran and other similar powers, and that's just because it's useful for them. They don't really care about Palestinians, but it's useful for their own foreign policy.
Okay. Now I know you said you only had a limited amount of time, so I'll just ask one more question. If you can answer that one, that would be great. Obviously there's a lot of varying opinions and things online. What would be something that you wish, like a piece of information or a perspective that you wish you could give to maybe one of the highly prevalent takes online that you disagree with? What would be that message, something that you would want them to hear? I know it's a very broad, very loose question, and there's a billion things that you'd probably disagree with, because whatever, but just anything in particular.
I mean, broadly, I would say it's the feeling of fear of survival. Like that's, I think like so many people like to act like Jews are particularly powerful, and they're certainly much more successful in a place like the United States. The vast majority of Jews don't live in the US, and even still, like on average, the type of Jewish person that say like, I know for example there used to be a lot of anti-Semitism within the rap community. I don't know how much it is still the case. But like I remember reading a lot about this. But it was because like a lot of the original producers and music owners were Jewish, and so it naturally felt like you had like these powerful guys who look like white men, right, who are taking advantage of your art, probably giving you shitty contracts, and it starts perpetuating this narrative. But it's like that's still a very small portion of who Jews are. The majority of Jews around the world are in this situation are just genuinely very scared of getting wiped out. We see like the cycle that happens all the time. I've been recently reading this amazing journal from a Russian Jew in the late 19th century who had originally always believed in integrating within Western society to end anti-Semitism, and then suddenly this huge anti-Semitism breaks down in the Russian Empire. The Russian emperor has an attempted assassination, and it's a Jew, so everyone automatically starts thinking, and the Russian Empire is having a bunch of problems, so they all say the Jews are the problem, right? And they become like the natural scapegoat. And he thought that anti-Semitism was done, that it was, we were living in like this modern age of the 19th century, right? And it was going to be over, and it was crazy to be in the same spot that his ancestors had been in. And I'm reading that, I'm going through the exact same thing right now. It's like horrific to watch the stuff that I'm seeing on the streets in Canada and in other places around the world. So there's this intense feeling of being terrified, feeling like Israel is literally our only hope for permanent sense of having power in our own hands, where we can trust that we'll be safe. That's why I think the majority of Jews support Israel. It's like from a sense of fear. And this is why you often see the most anti-Zionism from Jews who have not experienced a lot of anti-Semitism, or who have integrated so much that they've lost a lot of their Jewish character because they just haven't. It's the kind of the same thing that if like a black person that, I don't know, has really integrated into like white culture and, talks more like a white person or dresses more or whatever, they're going to deal with some less racism, and then they'll think that racism is less of a big deal. And I think just in general, I wish people understood that fear and how confirmed that fear was on October 7th. That's probably the biggest.
Eris, as I said before, I have a lot of respect for you as a person, and every interaction I've had with you has been something I cherish, just because you have always felt very human. I typically look at online people as like non-humans or bots, legitimately. It's just, I think it's best for sanity, legitimate. But I've never looked at you as a bot. And I think, obviously, I've like encountered so much media on this subject just like passively, because I never really been invested in this thing. And just the more I've encountered, I hear this other perspective, but I wanted to get your perspective because I believe in you as a human. And I thank you for being honest enough to say like, hey, obviously I'm biased, I'm Jewish, and I have these experiences and lived experiences, so on and so forth. But I think it is a difficult thing to share, because, and I remember originally when I reached out to you, at first you were like, yeah, I'm down to talk, and you were just like, I'm not in a good enough space to talk because of just how traumatic it was for you. And I respect and understand what that feels like to some degree, not nearly to the same experience that you've had probably. With that being said, I really do hope that you do find the peace that you're looking for. I do hope that there's an eventual peaceful situation. I remember growing up saying peace in the Middle East. I used to be like the way we would say goodbye. I don't know where it came from. I was just a child, like 9 years old, and it'd be like peace in the Middle East. I don't know what. Again, being completely uninformed politically, I just knew that was a phrase. The more I've learned now, the more I see like, wow, this has been an ongoing thing, and it's really, really intense.
Oh yeah, my grandfather fought in the 48 War. My dad fought in wars. Like my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. Like this just goes back for most Jews.
Man, thank you for sharing.
No problem. I don't mind talking again when I have more time as well, if you ever want to.
For sure. I would love to talk. We can have some conversations off stream too. But yeah, I sincerely appreciate you for sharing. Thank you.
This deep and floating too much in